When Ezra Blackwood laid down 3 queens and won a pregnant woman in a poker game, he thought he was just collecting another debt, but Elena Vasquez would prove to be the most dangerous gamble of his life. As hired guns close in to reclaim their property, and winter threatens to trap them all, Ezra must decide what he's truly willing to risk for a woman he barely knows. But when the cards are down and bullets start flying, will love be enough to beat the house, or will this be one hand that costs him everything? The cards were marked with blood, not real blood, but the kind that comes from desperate men who bet everything they have and lose. Ezra Blackwood could smell it in the smoky air of Murphy's saloon as thunder crashed outside, shaking the windows of the ramshackle building like an angry fist. The Wyoming Territory was a place where men came to disappear, and on this stormy night in October 1867, Ezra was doing his best to vanish into the bottom of a whiskey bottle. His father's silver pocket watch sat on the poker table, the last thing of value he owned besides his horse and his gun. 3 other men sat around the scarred wooden table, their faces lit by the flickering oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Your move, Blackwood," said Marcus Henley, a fat cattle baron who owned half the valley. His gold teeth flashed when he smiled, which wasn't often. Next to him sat a skinny merchant named Pike, whose nervous hands shook every time he touched his cards. But it was the 4th man who made Ezra's skin crawl. Garrett Mills was a stranger with pale eyes that reminded Ezra of winter ice. He wore expensive clothes and a wedding ring, but there was something rotten about him, like fruit that looked perfect on the outside but was black with decay within. When he'd sat down 3 hours ago, he'd said something that still echoed in Ezra's mind. "I've got collateral worth more than all your money combined." Rain hammered the roof above them like bullets, and somewhere in the distance, a woman was singing. Her voice drifted through the storm, a sad, beautiful sound that made Ezra think of his mother, who died when he was 12. The loneliness hit him harder than the whiskey, sharp and sudden as a knife between the ribs. Ezra picked up his cards with fingers that trembled slightly. 3 queens stared back at him, a strong hand, maybe strong enough to win back everything he'd lost. But poker wasn't just about the cards you held. It was about reading the men across from you, knowing when they were lying, when they were afraid, when they were about to strike. "I'll see your $100, Ezra said, pushing his remaining money into the center of the table. Then, before he could change his mind, he added his father's watch. "And I'll raise you this." The watch landed on the pile of bills with a soft thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. His father had carried that watch through the Civil War, through the long journey west, through the fever that finally killed him 2 winters ago. Now it sat on a poker table in a nowhere town, about to belong to someone else. Mills leaned back in his chair, studying Ezra with those cold, pale eyes. "Interesting," he said, his voice smooth as snake oil. "But I think I'll raise you something far more valuable than a timepiece." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. When he set it on the table, Ezra could see official-looking stamps and signatures. "A marriage certificate," Mills announced, "legal and binding. The woman's name is Elena Vasquez, and she's carrying a child." The saloon went dead silent. Even the piano player in the corner stopped his tinkling melody. Pike's mouth fell open, and Henley choked on his drink. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, and the woman's singing grew fainter, as if she were moving away into the storm. "You're betting your wife?" Pike whispered, his voice barely loud enough to hear over the rain. "My property," Mills corrected, and his smile was colder than a January morning. "I won her from her father in a card game 6 months ago. Debts of honor, you understand. But she's been nothing but trouble, won't do what she's told, talks back, fills her head with ideas about freedom, and now she's pregnant with some other man's bastard." Ezra felt anger rising in his chest like bile. He'd known men like Mills before, men who thought they could own other people, who treated women like cattle to be bought and sold. But there was something else stirring inside him too, something he couldn't quite name. Curiosity? Hope? The chance to do something decent for once in his miserable life? "Where is she now?" Ezra asked, his voice carefully neutral. "The boarding house on Maple Street," Mills said. "Room 7. She doesn't know about tonight's game yet, so she won't try to run." He leaned forward, his pale eyes glittering in the lamplight. "What do you say, Blackwood? Do you call, or do you fold like the coward everyone says you are?" The insult hit its mark, but Ezra didn't react. He'd heard worse from better men. Instead, he looked at his cards again, 3 beautiful queens that might be his salvation or his doom. Around the table, the other players waited, their breathing shallow with excitement. This was the kind of hand that people talked about for years afterward. The kind that became legend in a place where legends were rare. Lightning flashed outside, turning the windows white for a split second. In that brief moment of illumination, Ezra thought he saw something, a figure standing in the rain, watching the saloon. But when the darkness returned, there was nothing there except his imagination and the storm. "I call," he said quietly, laying his cards face up on the table. Mills stared at the 3 queens for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he turned over his own hand, 2 pairs, jacks and 7s. Good cards, but not good enough. The other players had already folded, their weaker hands scattered like dead leaves. For several heartbeats, nobody moved. The only sounds were the rain on the roof and the distant rumble of thunder. Then Mills stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor like fingernails on a chalkboard. "She's all yours," he said, pushing the marriage certificate across the table to Ezra. "But I'll give you some free advice. That woman is more trouble than she's worth. The smart thing would be to sell her as soon as possible." "Maybe I'm not as smart as you think," Ezra replied, picking up the certificate with hands that barely shook at all. Mills' laughed sound like breaking glass. "No, you're not, but you'll learn." He grabbed his coat and hat from the back of his chair. "Good luck, Blackwood. You're going to need every bit of it." The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the walls. For a moment, the 3 remaining men sat in silence, staring at the marriage certificate that lay on the table like a coiled snake. Finally, Pike spoke up, his voice cracking with nervousness. "What are you going to do with her?" Ezra folded the certificate carefully and slipped it into his vest pocket, next to his heart. "I guess I'm going to meet my wife," he said. Outside, the storm was getting worse. The rain came down in sheets now, turning the dirt streets into rivers of mud. But somewhere in that chaos, a woman was waiting in a boarding house room, probably wondering what her husband was up to, probably hoping he wouldn't come home drunk and angry like he usually did. She had no idea that her life had just changed forever. As Ezra gathered his winnings and prepared to step into the storm, he found himself wondering about the woman whose fate now rested in his pocket. What did she look like? What did she dream about? Was she as afraid as he was? Or did she have more courage than he'd ever possessed? There was only one way to find out. He pulled his hat down low and stepped into the rain, leaving behind the warm light of the saloon for the dark uncertainty of whatever came next. Behind him, Henley and Pike were already arguing about what they'd witnessed, their voices fading into the storm as Ezra walked away from his old life and towards something he couldn't yet imagine. The woman was still singing somewhere in the distance, her voice carried on the wind like a promise or a warning. Ezra couldn't tell which. But as he made his way through the muddy streets toward Maple Street and Room 7, he realized it didn't matter. Some gambles were worth taking, regardless of the odds. The boarding house looked like it was held together by prayer and stubbornness, its walls sagging under the weight of too many broken dreams. Ezra stood outside Room 7, rain dripping from his hat brim as he listened to the sounds on the other side of the door, careful footsteps, the creak of floorboards, the soft rustle of fabric. She knew someone was there. He could sense it in the sudden stillness, the way the movement stopped as if she were holding her breath. For a moment, he wondered if he should just walk away, pretend this whole night had been a bad dream. But the marriage certificate crinkled in his pocket when he moved, reminding him that some things couldn't be undone. "Mrs. Mills." His voice cracked slightly on the words. "My name is Ezra Blackwood. I need to speak with you." The silence stretched so long he began to think she'd somehow escaped through the window. Then, barely loud enough to hear over the storm, "Go away." "I'm afraid I can't do that, ma'am. You see, your husband and I just had a conversation and—" "Foma husband," came the sharp correction through the door. "I heard him packing his things an hour ago. Heard him cursing about losing everything to some fool cowboy. I assume that's you." Ezra blinked in surprise. She already knew? "Yes, ma'am. That would be me." "So what do you want? Come to claim your prize?" The bitterness in her voice cut deeper than he'd expected. "I came to talk, to figure out what happens next." A bitter laugh echoed through the thin wood. "What happens next is whatever you decide. That's how this works, isn't it? Men make choices, and women live with them. Maybe this time could be different, Ezra said quietly. Another long pause. Then the sound of a chair being moved, footsteps approaching the door. It opened just wide enough for him to see one dark eye studying him with the wariness of a cornered animal. Elena Vasquez was nothing like what he'd imagined. Younger, for one thing, maybe 25, with olive skin and black hair that fell past her shoulders in thick waves. Her dress was simple but clean, and despite everything she'd been through, she held herself with a dignity that made Ezra feel suddenly ashamed of his muddy boots and rain-soaked clothes. "You're not what I expected," she said, opening the door wider. "What did you expect?" "Someone older. Meaner." Mills said the men who frequent Murphy's saloon are the bottom of the barrel. She gestured for him to enter, then immediately moved to the far side of the small room, keeping the bed between them. The room was tiny but spotless, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk that looked like it held everything she owned. A small wooden cross hung on the wall above the bed, and there was a book of poetry on the nightstand, signs of a life that had once held hope and beauty. "How far along are you?" Ezra asked, nodding toward her belly, which showed the gentle curve of pregnancy beneath her dress. 6 months. Her hand moved protectively to her stomach. "The baby will come in winter." Mills made it clear that neither of us would be welcome after that. Ezra studied her face, noting the way she held her chin high despite the fear in her eyes. "What's your story? I mean, how did you end up married to a man like Mills?" Elena's laugh held no humor. "The same story as 1,000 other women. My father gambled away more money than he had, and when he couldn't pay, he offered me as collateral. Mills took the debt and the wife as a package deal. And the baby isn't his." Elena's voice was steady, but Ezra caught the slight tremor in her hands. "I was already pregnant when my father sold me. The child's father was a teacher in Santa Fe, good man who wanted to marry me. But my father had other plans." The rain continued to hammer the roof above them, and somewhere in the building, a baby was crying. The sound seemed to make Elena tense, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. "I have a ranch about 10 miles north of here," Ezra said carefully. "Nothing fancy, but it's honest land with good water and decent grazing. There's a spare room and—" He swallowed hard, the words sticking in his throat. "I give you my word that you'd be safe there." Elena turned to face him fully, and for the first time, he saw past the wariness to the intelligence and strength underneath. "And what would you want in return?" "I don't know," Ezra admitted. "I've never been married before. I suppose we'd figure it out as we go." "Just like that? You'd take in a pregnant stranger because you want her in a card game?" "I'd take you in because you deserve better than what you've had," Ezra said. "Because that baby deserves to be born free. Because—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound foolish. "Because I've been alone for 5 years, and maybe it's time to try something different." Elena moved to the window and stared out at the storm. In the lamplight, her profile was beautiful and sad, like a painting of a woman mourning for something lost. "You don't know anything about me. I could be a liar, a thief. Worse." "Could be," Ezra agreed. "But I don't think you are." "Why not?" "Because you're scared, but you're not broken. Because you're protecting that baby, even though you have no power to protect yourself. Because you kept that book of poetry even when you probably had to choose between it and something more practical." Elena turned to look at him, surprise flickering across her face. "You noticed the book." "I noticed everything." Ezra moved closer, but not close enough to crowd her. "I noticed the way you moved careful but not defeated. I noticed the cross on the wall and the way you kept your room clean even when you had no reason to hope. Those aren't the actions of a bad person." For a moment, Elena's composure cracked, and he saw the exhaustion underneath the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been fighting for too long. "What if I said yes? What if I came with you? What would people think?" "People will think what they want to think regardless," Ezra said. "But the people worth knowing will judge us by our actions, not our circumstances." Elena was quiet for a long time, her gaze moving between his face and the storm outside. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want my child to be born free. I want to sleep without wondering if tomorrow will bring a beating. I want—" She paused, as if the words were too dangerous to speak aloud. "I want to matter to someone." "You already matter," Ezra said simply. Elena's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. You say that now, but you don't know me. What if you change your mind? What if you decide I'm more trouble than I'm worth? Then I guess we'll deal with that if it happens, Ezra replied. But I don't think it will. Elena moved to her trunk and began carefully folding her few possessions. She worked with practiced efficiency, like someone who'd learned to pack quickly and travel light. I'll need a wagon for the journey. The doctor says I shouldn't ride horseback anymore. I'll arrange for one in the morning, Ezra said. We can leave after breakfast if you're ready. I've been ready for a long time, Elena said, and something in her voice suggested she'd been waiting for this moment longer than she cared to admit. As she packed, Ezra found himself studying the small details that revealed who she was, the way she folded each piece of clothing with care, the gentle way she wrapped the wooden cross in a piece of soft cloth, the fact that the book of poetry was the last thing to go into the trunk, as if she couldn't bear to put it away until the very end. What's the book? He asked. Pablo Neruda, Elena said, holding it for a moment before placing it carefully on top of her other belongings. A teacher in Santa Fe gave it to me. He said poetry was the language of the soul. Do you believe that? Elena closed the trunk and turned to face him. I want to. I want to believe that there's still beauty in the world, even when everything seems dark. There is, Ezra said with quiet conviction. Sometimes you just have to look harder to find it. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease. The rain had gentled to a steady patter, and the thunder had moved off toward the mountains. Through the window, Ezra could see the first hints of dawn touching the eastern sky. Are you afraid? Elena asked suddenly. Terrified, Ezra admitted. I don't know how to be a husband. I certainly don't know how to be a father. But I figure fear isn't necessarily a bad thing. Maybe it means we'll try harder. Elena almost smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. At least you're honest about not knowing. Mills pretended to have all the answers. And how did that work out? About as well as you'd expect. Elena picked up her shawl and wrapped it around her shoulders. When do we leave? First light. The road to the ranch is rough, but it's beautiful country. You'll like it. There are mountains to the west. Good water, sky so big it makes you feel like you can breathe again. Elena nodded, then moved to the window one last time. In the growing light, Ezra could see her reflection in the glass, a young woman caught between fear and hope, carrying new life within her and facing an uncertain future. Ezra? She said without turning around. Yes? Thank you for giving me a choice. It's been a long time since anyone did that. As they prepared to leave the boarding house behind and start their journey towards something neither of them could quite imagine, Ezra realized that winning Elena in that poker game might have been the luckiest hand he'd ever played. But luck, he was beginning to understand, was only the beginning. What came next would depend on something much more valuable than cards or chance. It would depend on the choices they made and the courage they found to make them together. The sun was setting like a copper coin behind the mountains when Elena first saw the ranch that would either become her home or her prison. 3 weeks had passed since that stormy night in the boarding house. 3 weeks of learning to live with a man who asked nothing of her but gave everything he could. The wagon wheels crunched over fallen leaves as they approached the small log cabin that sat in a valley so beautiful it made Elena's chest ache. Golden aspens dotted the hillsides like scattered coins, and a clear stream wound through the pasture where cattle grazed peacefully. It wasn't grand or impressive, but it felt solid and real in a way that nothing in her life had for a very long time. It's perfect, she whispered, her hand resting on her rounded belly where the baby kicked restlessly. Ezra glanced at her with surprise. It's not much to look at. The cabin's small, and the barn needs work, and it's perfect, Elena repeated, and meant it. She'd learned to find beauty in small things: a warm meal, a roof that didn't leak, a man who spoke kindly to her. This place offered all of that and more. As they climbed down from the wagon, Elena noticed movement on the ridge above them. A lone rider sat silhouetted against the darkening sky, too far away to identify but close enough to feel like a threat. She'd seen him twice before during their journey, always distant, always watching, always disappearing when she tried to point him out to Ezra. Ezra, she said quietly, not wanting to alarm him but needing to know, there's someone on the ridge. He followed her gaze, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip. The rider was there for a moment, then gone, vanishing into the gathering dusk like smoke. Probably just a drifter, Ezra said. but Elena heard the uncertainty in his voice. Inside the cabin, Elena was surprised by how comfortable it felt. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything was clean and organized. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and colorful blankets hung from pegs near the door. It was the home of a man who cared about his surroundings, who took pride in what he'd built. "The bedroom's through there," Ezra said, pointing to a doorway covered by a curtain. "I'll take the loft. There's a good bed, and it's warmer down here for you and the baby." Elena nodded, touched by his thoughtfulness. Most men would have expected her to share their bed immediately, would have considered it their right as her husband, but Ezra had never once made her feel like property to be claimed. As she unpacked her few belongings, Elena found herself thinking about the teacher in Santa Fe, Miguel Santos, the father of her child. He'd been gentle and kind, full of dreams about changing the world through education. When she told him about the pregnancy, he'd wanted to marry her immediately, to give their child his name and his protection. But her father had other plans. He'd already promised her to Mills to cover his gambling debts, and nothing Miguel could offer would change that. The last time she'd seen him, he'd pressed a silver locket into her hands and made her promise to name their child after his mother if it was a girl, his father if it was a boy. The locket lay hidden in the bottom of her trunk now, beneath her few dresses and the book of poetry. Sometimes, late at night, she would take it out and remember what it felt like to be loved by someone who saw her as more than just a burden to be carried. "Elena?" Ezra's voice came from the main room. "Are you hungry? I could fix some supper." "Let me help," she said, emerging from the bedroom. "I'm not an invalid." Together, they prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, working side by side in the small kitchen. Elena noticed how Ezra moved around her carefully, always making sure she had enough space, never crowding her or making her feel trapped. It was a kindness she'd never experienced before. "Tell me about your father," Elena said as they ate by the light of an oil lamp. "What was he like?" Ezra's face softened. "He was a good man, patient, hard-working, never complained about anything. He came west after the war, looking for a place where he could build something that would last. He used to say that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he owned, but by what he was willing to sacrifice for others." "Is that why you took me in? Because of what he taught you?" "Partly," Ezra admitted, "but mostly because it felt like the right thing to do. You were in trouble, and I had the means to help. It wasn't complicated." Elena studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the honesty there, the simple decency that seemed to guide everything he did. Most men would have expected something in return. "I'm not most men," Ezra said quietly. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the porch. Elena tensed, thinking of the rider on the ridge, wondering if he was still out there in the darkness, watching and waiting. "Are you afraid?" Ezra asked, noticing her reaction. "Always," Elena admitted. "I've been afraid for so long that I don't remember what it feels like not to be." "What scares you the most?" Elena considered the question. "That this is all temporary, that someone will come and take it away, like everything else good in my life has been taken away." Ezra reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I won't let that happen." "You can't promise that," Elena said, but she didn't pull her hand away. "You don't know what men like Mills are capable of." "Then maybe it's time I learned." Over the following days, Elena began to settle into the rhythm of ranch life. She tended the vegetable garden, helped with the cooking and cleaning, and slowly began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she belonged. But the rider on the ridge appeared more frequently now, sometimes in the morning when she hung laundry, sometimes at dusk when she fed the chickens. He never came closer, never showed his face, but his presence was like a dark cloud on the horizon, promising storms to come. Elena tried to convince herself that she was imagining things, that her fear was making her see threats where none existed. But deep down, she knew better. Men like Mills didn't give up easily, and the debts of her father wouldn't disappear just because she'd found happiness. On the 10th day after their arrival, Elena was working in the garden when she heard hoofbeats approaching. She looked up to see a man riding toward the cabinet, the mysterious watcher from the ridge, but someone else entirely. He was well-dressed and well-armed, with the kind of confidence that came from wealth and power. "Mrs. Blackwood," he called out as he dismounted. "I'm Clayton Morse. I believe we need to talk." Elena felt the bottom drop out of her world. She'd never seen this man before, but she recognized the type, the kind who collected debts and never took no for an answer. The kind who would see her child as collateral to be claimed. "My husband isn't here," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "That's all right," Morse said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This concerns you more than him anyway. You see, I represent certain business interests that have a claim on you and your condition." "I don't know what you're talking about," Elena said, but her hand moved protectively to her belly. "Of course you do," Morse said. "Your father's debts didn't disappear when he died, Mrs. Blackwood. They merely transferred to new creditors, and those creditors have decided it's time to collect." Elena felt the world spinning around her. Her father was dead? When? How? And what did this man want with her? "I can see you're confused," Morse continued. "Perhaps we should wait for your husband to return. I'm sure he'll be very interested in what I have to say." As if summoned by her fear, Ezra appeared at the edge of the pasture, driving a small herd of cattle toward the barn. When he saw the stranger talking to Elena, his entire demeanor changed. He left the cattle and rode hard toward the cabin, his face grim with determination. "Can I help you?" Ezra asked, dismounting and positioning himself between Morse and Elena. "I certainly hope so," Morse said. "I'm here about a debt that needs to be settled. A very substantial debt." Elena felt her knees go weak. The happiness she'd found here, the peace she'd begun to believe in it, was all about to be torn away. The rider on the ridge, the feeling of being watched, the constant fear that had followed her from Townit had all been leading to this moment. "What kind of debt?" Ezra asked, though Elena could tell he already suspected the answer. $4,700, Morse said with obvious satisfaction, plus interest. The kind of debt that requires creative solutions. Elena sank onto the porch steps, her hand pressed to her chest where her heart was hammering like a trapped bird. She'd known this day would come, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon. But knowing and experiencing were two different things entirely. "We don't have that kind of money," Ezra said quietly. "No," Morse agreed, "but you have something far more valuable. You have her, and in a few months, you'll have the child as well. There are wealthy families in California who would pay handsomely for such commodities." The word hit Elena like a physical blow. Commodities. That's all she was to men like this, something to be bought and sold, traded and collected. She thought of Miguel, of the love they'd shared, of the child growing inside her who deserved to be born free. "Get off my land," Ezra said, his voice deadly quiet. "I'm afraid I can't do that," Morse replied. "But I'm a reasonable man. I'll give you 3 days to raise the money. After that, I'll be back to collect what's owed." He remounted his horse and rode away, leaving Elena and Ezra standing in the gathering dusk, facing a future that suddenly seemed as dark and uncertain as the storm clouds gathering over the mountains. "I'm sorry," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I should have told you about my father's debts. I should have known they would find me." Ezra knelt beside her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "This isn't your fault, and we'll figure out a way through it." "How?" Elena asked. $4,700 is more money than most people see in a lifetime. "I don't know," Ezra admitted. "But I know I'm not letting anyone take you away from here. This is your home now, and that baby is going to be born free." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Elena allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that love might be enough to overcome the debts of the past. But deep down, she knew that men like Morse always collected what they believed was owed to them, one way or another. The only question was how much it would cost to keep her freedom and whether they could afford to pay the price. The second morning dawned cold and gray, with frost covering the windows like spiderwebs made of ice. Elena had barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities and fears, each one darker than the last. The baby had been restless too, kicking and turning as if sensing her distress. Ezra was already up and dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread before him and a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight, his face drawn with worry and exhaustion. "How bad is it?" Elena asked, settling carefully into the chair across from him. "Bad," Ezra said without looking up from his calculations. "I've got maybe $300 in cash. Another $500 in cattle if I can find buyers quickly. The ranch is worth more, but, he shrugged helplessly, there's no way to sell it and get the money in 3 days. Elena studied the numbers he'd written, her heart sinking with each line. Even if they sold everything they owned, they'd still be thousands of dollars short. What about the other ranchers? The ones who helped us before? I can't ask them to risk their families' futures for my problems, Ezra said firmly. Besides, even if they all pooled their money, it wouldn't be enough. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Elena's heart leaped into her throat. Had Morse returned early? But when Ezra opened the door, it was Jim Thompson, their neighbor from the next valley over. "Morning, Ezra," Thompson said, removing his hat. "Hope I'm not disturbing anything, but I wanted to talk to you about something." "Come in," Ezra said, though Elena could see the tension in his shoulders. "Coffee?" "Don't mind if I do," Thompson said, settling into a chair. He was a big man, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. "I heard you might be having some trouble with debt collectors." Ezra and Elena exchanged glances. "Word travels fast," Ezra said. "Billy Peterson was hunting up on the ridge yesterday," Thompson explained. "Saw a well-dressed stranger watching your place, then saw him ride down to talk to you. The boy's got sharp eyes and a good memory. When he described the man, I recognized the type." "What type is that?" Elena asked. "The kind that collects debts for rich men who don't want to dirty their own hands," Thompson said grimly. "I've seen his kind before. They always travel in packs, and they always come back with more men than they started with." As if summoned by his words, the sound of multiple horses echoed across the valley. Elena moved to the window and felt her blood turn to ice. 6 riders were approaching the ranch, spread out in a formation that would make escape impossible. "He's back," she whispered. Ezra grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace and checked the load. "Elena, get to the root cellar. Stay there until I tell you it's safe." "No," Elena said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I won't hide while other people fight my battles." "This isn't your battle," Ezra said urgently. "This is about money and debts and—" "This is about me," Elena interrupted. "About my child. If I'm going to be free, I need to stand up for myself." Thompson stood and moved to the other window, his own gun in hand. "She's right, Ezra. Sometimes running just makes the chase longer." The riders drew closer, and Elena could see that they were all armed, all professional. These weren't local cowboys or drifters. They were men who killed for money, who saw violence as just another tool of their trade. Morse rode at the center of the group, his expensive clothes and confident bearing making him look like a gentleman farmer rather than what he truly was. When he called out, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Blackwood, I trust you've had time to consider my offer." Ezra stepped onto the porch, his rifle held ready but not obviously threatening. "We're still working on raising the money. I'm afraid time has run out," Morse said with false regret. "You see, I've received word that other parties are interested in collecting on this debt. I can't risk losing my investment to competition." "What other parties?" Elena asked, appearing in the doorway despite Ezra's attempts to keep her inside. "Does it matter?" Morse's smile was cold as winter wind. "The fact remains that you're coming with me. Today." "Like hell she is," Ezra said, his voice carrying across the yard like a gunshot. "Mr. Blackwood," Morse said patiently, "you're outnumbered 6-1. Be reasonable." "Reasonable?" Ezra laughed harshly. "You want to kidnap my pregnant wife and sell her like livestock? And you're asking me to be reasonable?" "I'm asking you to be practical," Morse replied. "You can't win this fight, but you can walk away from it. I'm prepared to offer you $500 for your inconvenience. Take the money and start over somewhere else." "Not for all the money in the world," Ezra said. From her position in the doorway, Elena could see the hired guns tensing, their hands moving closer to their weapons. The moment was balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word or sudden movement away from violence. "What if I went willingly?" she heard herself say. "What if I agreed to work off the debt instead of being sold?" "Elena, no," Ezra said sharply. "It's an interesting proposition," Morse said, though his tone suggested he was merely toying with her. "But I'm afraid the debt is too large, the interest too high. You'd be working for the rest of your life and never pay it off." "Then that's what I'll do," Elena said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "But I have conditions." "Elena, stop this," Ezra said, reaching for her arm. She stepped away from him. her eyes never leaving Morse's face. My child goes free, born free, raised free, with no debts attached, and my husband is left alone. Morse considered this, his head tilted like a predator studying wounded prey. The child represents considerable value. Half Mexican children are quite popular in certain circles, especially in California. The words hit Elena like a physical blow, and she felt Ezra's rage building beside her like heat from a forge. She knew what was coming, could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his finger found the trigger of his rifle. "You son of a bitch," Ezra said, raising his weapon. "Don't," Elena said urgently. "He's right about the odds." "I don't care about the odds," Ezra replied, his voice deadly calm. "Some things are worth fighting for, even if you can't win." The hired guns drew their weapons, and Elena closed her eyes, waiting for the thunder of gunfire that would end everything. But instead, she heard something else, the sound of more horses, lots of them, coming fast from the direction of the main road. "What the hell?" one of Morse's men muttered. A dozen riders crested the hill, riding hard toward the ranch. Elena recognized the lead rider, Jim Thompson, had somehow slipped away and brought reinforcements. Behind him rode Carl Hendricks, Pete Morrison, and nearly every rancher in the valley, all armed and grim-faced. "Well," Morse said, his confidence wavering for the first time, "this is unexpected." Thompson rode up to the edge of the confrontation, his hand resting on his gun. "Afternoon, Blackwood. Heard you might be having some trouble." "How did you?" Ezra began. "I sent Billy Peterson to spread the word," Thompson said, his eyes never leaving Morse. "Told him to ride to every ranch in the valley. Tell them what was happening. Word travels fast when it's about protecting our own." "This is a private matter," Morse said, trying to regain his composure. "Nothing's private when it involves threatening our neighbors," Carl Hendricks said, his voice gravelly with age and authority. "This is our valley, and we look after our own." Elena felt tears stinging her eyes. These men barely knew her, had no reason to risk their lives for a stranger. But they were here anyway, willing to fight for her because she was one of them now, because she belonged to their community. "You don't understand," Morse said desperately. "This woman has debts, legal obligations that supersede any local loyalties." "The woman is Elena Blackwood," Thompson said firmly. "She's one of us now, and we don't let outsiders come into our valley and threaten our people." The tide had turned completely. Morse's hired guns were skilled and dangerous, but they were outnumbered 2-1 by men who knew the terrain and fought for something more than money. Elena could see the calculation in Morse's eyes, the weighing of odds and options. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice tight with frustrated rage. "There are courts, legal processes, writs of attachment. I'll be back with proper authority." "You do that," Thompson said evenly. "We'll be waiting." As Morse and his men rode away, Elena felt her legs give out. She sank onto the porch steps, overwhelmed by the simple generosity of these rough men who had risked everything for her. "Why?" she asked, looking up at Thompson. "Why would you do this for someone you barely know?" "Because you're Ezra's wife," Thompson said kindly. "That makes you family, and family looks out for each other. Besides," old Carl added with a grin, "my wife heard you make the best bread in the county. Can't let someone like that get kidnapped." Elena laughed through her tears, understanding for the first time in her life what it meant to belong somewhere, to be part of something bigger than herself. But even as she celebrated this small victory, she knew that Morse's words carried weight. He would be back, and next time he'd bring the law with him. The fight was far from over, but for the first time since this all began, Elena felt like she might actually have a chance to win. The first snow of winter fell like ash from heaven, covering Elena's world in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. But beneath the beauty, danger lurked like a wolf in sheep's clothing, and Elena could feel it watching her from the shadows. 2 weeks had passed since Morse's retreat, 2 weeks of false peace that felt more like the calm before a storm. Elena's belly had grown rounder, the baby more active, and she'd begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, they'd won their fight for freedom. But that morning, everything changed. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the sound of a single horse approaching. Not the thunder of multiple riders like before, but something quieter, more careful. Elena's hands stilled on the damp sheet she was pinning, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The rider who emerged from the trees was a young man, maybe 20, with nervous eyes and clothes that had seen better days. He dismounted awkwardly, like someone who wasn't comfortable on horseback, and approached the cabin with his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Blackwood?" he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm Billy Martinez from the telegraph office in town. I have a message for you." Elena felt her heart skip a beat. Telegraph messages rarely brought good news, especially not to people like her. What kind of message? "It's from someone named Miguel Santos in Santa Fe," Billy said, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "He says it's urgent." Elena's world tilted sideways. Miguel, the father of her child, the man she'd loved and lost, the teacher who'd wanted to give her a different life. She'd thought she'd never hear from him again, had tried to bury those memories deep where they couldn't hurt her anymore. With shaking hands, she took the telegram and read the brief message. "Elena, stop, father died, stop, left money, stop, coming to find you, stop, wait for me, stop, Miguel." The paper fluttered from her fingers like a dying bird. Miguel was coming here. He'd somehow found out where she was, and he was traveling across dangerous territory to reach her. But she was married now, carrying his child but legally bound to another man. The complications made her head spin. "Ma'am?" Billy asked, clearly concerned by her reaction. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Elena lied, though she felt anything but fine. Is there a reply?" "The sender said to wait for him," Billy said. "Said he'd be here within the week." After Billy left, Elena sat on the porch steps, staring at the telegram until the words blurred together. Miguel was coming. The one person in the world who had loved her for herself, not as property or burden or prize to be won. The man who'd given her the child she carried, who'd begged her to run away with him before her father's debts caught up with them. But what would his arrival mean for Ezra? For the life they'd begun to build together? For the community that had accepted her as one of their own? She was still sitting there when Ezra returned from checking the cattle, his face red with cold and his boots crunching in the snow. He took one look at her expression and was beside her in an instant. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice gentle but urgent. Elena handed him the telegram without a word. She watched his face change as he read, saw the understanding dawn in his eyes, followed by something that might have been pain. "Miguel Santos," he said quietly, "the teacher, the father of your child." "Yes," Elena whispered, unable to meet his eyes. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, staring at the telegram as if it might reveal some hidden meaning. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Do you want to see him?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Elena wanted to say no, wanted to pretend that her past could stay buried, that she could build a future without dealing with the complicated emotions Miguel's return would bring. But she also knew that wasn't possible. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought I'd never see him again. I thought that chapter of my life was closed. But now it's not," Ezra said, and she heard the sadness in his voice. "Ezra," Elena said, finally looking at him, "whatever happens, whatever I decide, I want you to know that these past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. You've given me something I never thought I'd have: safety, kindness, the chance to be myself." "But," Ezra prompted, "but Miguel loved me when I was just Elena, not someone's debt or someone's prize. He wanted to marry me, to raise our child together, maybe." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Maybe he can give you something I can't," Ezra said softly. Before Elena could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. But this time, it wasn't enemies or neighbors. It was a single rider pushing a tired horse hard through the snow. As the figure drew closer, Elena felt her heart stop. It was Miguel. He looked older than she remembered, his face weathered by travel and worry, but his eyes were the same warm brown that had haunted her dreams. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and covered the distance between them in a few long strides. "Elena," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Mi amor, I've been looking for you everywhere." Elena stood slowly, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. "Miguel, you're early." "I couldn't wait," he said, his eyes drinking in the sight of her. "When I heard about your father's death, about the debts, I knew I had to find you. I should have fought harder before. I should have protected you." Ezra cleared his throat, reminding them both of his presence. Miguel's eyes shifted to him, taking in his worn clothes and work-hardened hands, the way he stood protectively near Elena. "You must be the man who married her," Miguel said, his voice cool but not unfriendly. "Ezra Blackwood," Ezra said, extending his hand. "And you're Miguel Santos." "I am," Miguel said, shaking Ezra's hand briefly. "I've come to take Elena home." "This is her home now," Ezra said quietly. "Is it?" Miguel looked at Elena, his eyes pleading. "Is this really what you want? To be married to a stranger? To live in the middle of nowhere? To pretend that what we had meant nothing?" Elena felt tears burning her eyes. "It's not that simple, Miguel. So much has happened. My father sold me to pay his debts, and when that man lost me in a card game, Ezra won me. But he's been kind to me, kinder than anyone has ever been." "Kind?" Miguel's voice rose slightly. "Elena, I love you. I've loved you since the first day I saw you. That's worth more than kindness." "Miguel," Elena said, her voice breaking, "I'm married now. Legally married. Even if I wanted to leave with you, how could I? The law can be changed," Miguel said urgently. "I have money now. My father left me his estate. I can hire lawyers, fight the marriage, prove it was made under duress. We can be together, Elena. We can raise our child together." Elena looked between the two men, seeing the pain in both their faces. Miguel, who had loved her first and longest, who had given her the child she carried. Ezra, who had saved her from a life of slavery, who had asked nothing of her but given everything he had. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course," Miguel said. "I'm staying at the hotel in town. But Elena, please don't take too long. Every day we're apart is a day we can't get back." After Miguel left, Elena and Ezra sat in their kitchen, the silence between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Ezra spoke. "He's right, you know, about the law. A good lawyer could probably get the marriage annulled, especially if you testified that you were forced into it." "Is that what you want?" Elena asked. "I want you to be happy," Ezra said simply. "If that means being with him, then that's what I want." Elena felt her heart breaking. "And what about what you want? What about your happiness?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment. "I've been happy these past weeks. Happier than I ever thought I could be. But I won't keep you here if you belong somewhere else." That night, Elena lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. In the bed next to her, Ezra pretended to sleep, but she could tell from his breathing that he was as restless as she was. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her turmoil. Elena pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the life growing inside her. Miguel's child, who deserved to know his father, who deserved to be born into love rather than obligation. But what about Ezra? What about the man who had given her safety when she had none, who had stood up to dangerous men to protect her, who had asked nothing of her, but offered everything he had? Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering their world in white, making everything look clean and new. But Elena knew that some stains couldn't be washed away. Some choices couldn't be undone. Tomorrow, she would have to make a decision that would change all their lives forever. She just hoped she had the wisdom to choose correctly. In the distance, a coyote howled, and Elena wondered if it was calling to its mate or mourning something lost. Either way, the sound seemed to echo the loneliness in her own heart. Dawn broke gray and cold, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of silver and shadow. Elena stood at the kitchen window, watching the sunrise and trying to find courage in the beauty of the morning. Today was the day she would have to choose between two men, two futures, two different kinds of love. The sound of horse hooves on frozen ground announced Miguel's arrival. He'd come early, as she'd somehow known he would. Elena opened the door before he could knock, and she saw hope blazing in his dark eyes. "Have you decided?" he asked without preamble. "I need to show you something first," Elena said, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "Walk with me." They made their way across the snow-covered yard to the small cemetery where Ezra's father was buried. Elena knelt beside the simple wooden cross, brushing snow away from the carved inscription, "Robert Blackwood, a man who built something that will last." "Ezra's father built this ranch from nothing," Elena said, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "He taught his son that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he's willing to sacrifice for others." Miguel knelt beside her, his face serious. "What are you trying to tell me?" "I'm trying to tell you that Ezra saved my life," Elena said. Not just from Mills, not just from the debt collectors, but from something worse. He saved me from believing that I was worthless, that I was nothing more than property to be traded. And I love you for who you are, Miguel said urgently. I always have. From the first moment I saw you in that classroom in Santa Fe, I knew you were special. I saw your intelligence, your kindness, your strength. I wanted to marry you then, not because I owned you, but because I couldn't imagine my life without you. Elena felt tears freezing on her cheeks. I know, and I loved you too. I still do, in a way. But Miguel, love isn't always enough. How can you say that? Miguel asked, his voice breaking. Love is everything. It's what makes us human, what gives our lives meaning. No, Elena said firmly. What makes us human is the choices we make, the way we treat each other when we don't have to, the sacrifices we make for people who can't repay us. She stood, brushing snow from her skirt. Ezra chose to help me when he had nothing to gain. He chose to protect me when it put him in danger. He chose to give me freedom when he could have demanded obedience. But he's not the father of your child, Miguel said desperately. I am. That has to count for something. It counts for everything, Elena said, which is why I've made my decision. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, leaving Miguel to follow. Inside, she found Ezra sitting at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He looked up when they entered, and Elena saw resignation in his eyes. I'm staying, Elena said simply. The words hung in the air like a bell that had been rung, impossible to take back. Miguel's face went white, and Ezra's expression shifted from resignation to something that might have been hope. Elena, Miguel said, his voice pleading. You can't mean that. We belong together. We have a child coming. We have a child coming, Elena agreed. But Miguel, I'm not the same person I was in Santa Fe. I've changed. I've learned things about myself that I never knew before. I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought, that I can build a life for myself, that I don't need to be rescued. But you love me, Miguel said, his voice breaking. You said so yourself. I did love you, Elena said gently, and part of me always will. But love isn't just about feeling, Miguel. It's about choosing to build something together, day after day, even when it's hard. It's about sacrifice and commitment, and putting someone else's needs before your own. She moved to stand beside Ezra, her hand resting on his shoulder. Ezra has shown me that kind of love. Not the passionate, desperate kind that burns bright and fast, but the steady, enduring kind that lasts through winters and storms and all the ordinary days in between. What about our child? Miguel asked. What about my rights as a father? Elena felt the baby kick, as if responding to the sound of its father's voice. Our child will know who you are, she said. I'll tell him about his father, about the man who loved learning and wanted to change the world through education. But he'll be raised by the man who chose to be his father, who'll teach him to work with his hands and treat people with respect and build something that will last. Miguel stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally, a deep, profound sadness. This is my fault, he said quietly. I should have fought harder for you. I should have taken you away from Santa Fe before your father could sell you. No, Elena said firmly. This isn't about what you should have done. It's about what I'm choosing to do now. I'm choosing to stay with the man who won me in a card game and then spend every day afterward proving that he saw me as more than a prize. Ezra stood slowly, his hand covering Elena's. Miguel, he said, his voice careful and respectful. I want you to know that I'll never try to keep your child from knowing about you. If you want to visit, if you want to be part of his life, you'll always be welcome here. His life? Miguel asked, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. You think it's a boy? I hope so, Elena said. I hope he looks like you, so I'll always remember the good parts of our time together. Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenched at his sides. Finally, he nodded. If this is really what you want, then I'll respect your choice. But Elena, if you ever change your mind, if you ever need anything, you know where to find me. I know, Elena said. And Miguel, thank you for loving me, for coming to find me, for giving me this choice. It means more than you know. After Miguel left, Elena and Ezra stood in their kitchen, the silence between them different now, not heavy with unspoken fears, but warm with shared understanding. "Are you sure?" Ezra asked. "About staying, I mean. Because if you have any doubts—" "I'm sure," Elena said, turning to face him. "I'm sure because you're the man who asks me what I want instead of telling me what I need. I'm sure because you've shown me that marriage can be about partnership instead of ownership. I'm sure because when I look at you, I see the father I want for my child." Ezra pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I love you," he said simply. "I've loved you since that first night in the boarding house, when you opened that door and looked at me like I might be different from all the other men who'd hurt you." "I love you too," Elena said, and realized that she meant it in a way that was deeper and more real than anything she'd felt before. "Not because you saved me, but because you helped me save myself." Outside, the snow continued to fall. But inside their small cabin, Elena felt warm and safe, and for the first time in her life, truly free. She'd made her choice, and it felt right in a way that had nothing to do with obligation or gratitude or fear. It felt like coming home. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the wind outside, Elena felt the baby kick strongly. She placed Ezra's hand on her belly, and together they felt the life growing inside Hera, life that would be born into love and freedom and the promise of a better future. "What should we name him?" Ezra asked. Elena thought of Miguel's request, of the tradition he'd wanted to honor. "Miguel," she said, "after his father, but his middle name should be Robert, after your father." "Miguel Robert Blackwood," Ezra said, testing the sound of it. "I like it. And if it's a girl?" "Isabella," Elena said, thinking of Miguel's mother. Isabella Elena Blackwood. As they drifted off to sleep, Elena felt something she'd never experienced before: complete peace. She'd made her choice, and it was the right one. Not because it was easy, not because it was expected, but because it was hers. For the first time in her life, Elena Blackwood was exactly where she belonged. The baby was coming 3 weeks early, and Elena was going to Dior. At least, that's what it felt like, as another wave of pain crashed over her like a mountain avalanche. The blizzard outside howled like a living thing, trapping them in the cabin with no way to reach the doctor in town. "Breathe, Elena," Ezra said, his voice steady despite the panic in his eyes. "Just breathe through it." But Elena couldn't breathe. The contractions were coming faster now, harder, like nothing she'd ever experienced. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold, and her hands gripped the bedsheet so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Something's wrong," she gasped between contractions. "This isn't how it's supposed to feel." Ezra knelt beside the bed, his calloused hands gentle on her face. "Mrs. Henderson is on her way. She's delivered more babies than anyone in the valley. She'll know what to do." But Elena could see the doubt in his eyes. The storm had been raging for 2 days, dumping snow so deep that travel was nearly impossible. Even if Mrs. Henderson could make it through the drifts, would she arrive in time? Another contraction hit, stronger than the last, and Elena cried out. Through the window, she could see nothing but a wall of snow and wind that seemed to cut them off from the rest of the world. They were alone, and the baby was coming whether they were ready or not. "Elena?" Ezra's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Stay with me. Don't give up." But Elena felt herself slipping away, pulled under by waves of pain that seemed to have no end. In her delirium, she thought she heard her father's voice, calling her name, then Miguel's, telling her to be strong. Then her mother's, singing the lullaby she'd sung when Elena was small. "Mama," she whispered, and for a moment, she was 5 years old again, safe in her mother's arms. "I'm here," Ezra said, though she'd been talking to a ghost. "I'm right here." The sound of his voice anchored her, pulled her back from the edge of darkness. She opened her eyes and saw him clearly, not Miguel, with his book-learning and gentle hands, not Mills with his cold cruelty, but Ezra, the man who had chosen to love her, who had stood by her through everything. "The baby," she said urgently. "Is the baby?" "The baby's fine," Ezra said, though she could tell he was guessing. "Everything's going to be fine." But even as he spoke, Elena felt something shift inside her, something that made her body scream with alarm. The pain changed, became sharper, more urgent. She felt warm liquid between her legs and saw Ezra's face go white. "Oh God," he whispered. "Blood, too much blood." Elena had grown up on a ranch. She knew what it meant when there was too much blood. She was going to die, and her baby was going to die with her, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. "Ezra," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "If something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said fiercely. "I won't let it." But Elena knew better. She'd seen too many women die in childbirth, too many babies who never drew their first breath. Death was a part of life on the frontier, as common as sunrise and just as inevitable. "Promise me," she said, gripping his hand with what little strength she had left. "Promise me, you'll tell the baby about Miguel, about who his real father was." "You're going to tell him yourself," Ezra said, but his voice was thick with tears. "Promise me," Elena repeated. "I promise," Ezra said, and she saw that he meant it. Just then, the door burst open, letting in a swirl of snow and wind. Mrs. Henderson stumbled into the cabin, her face red with cold and her clothes covered in ice. She was a small woman, but she moved with the confidence of someone who had faced death many times and usually won. "How long has she been in labor?" she asked, already rolling up her sleeves. "Since dawn," Ezra said. "Maybe longer. She's been bleeding." "I can see that," Mrs. Henderson said crisply. "Get me hot water and clean towels. And build up that fire, we need this room warm." As Ezra hurried to follow her orders, Mrs. Henderson examined Elena with practiced hands. Her face was grim, but Elena caught something else in her expression: determination, maybe even hope. "The baby's turned wrong," she said. "That's why there's so much blood. But I've seen worse. We can fix this." "Fix it how?" Elena asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "I'm going to have to turn the baby," Mrs. Henderson said matter-of-factly. "It's going to hurt something fierce, but it's the only way to save both of you." Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She'd heard about women who had to have their babies turned. Some lived, some didn't, but at least there was a chance. "Ezra," Mrs. Henderson called, "I need you to hold her shoulders. Keep her still no matter what happens." What happened next was pain beyond anything Elena had ever imagined. She felt Mrs. Henderson's hands inside her, felt the baby moving, turning, struggling to find its way into the world. She bit down on the leather strap Mrs. Henderson had given her and tried not to scream. "Almost there," Mrs. Henderson muttered. "Just a little more. There. The head's in position." Elena felt a moment of relief, then a new kind of pain as her body took over, pushing the baby toward birth. She could feel Ezra's hands on her shoulders, steady and strong, and she drew strength from his presence. "Push, Elena," Mrs. Henderson commanded. "Push now." Elena pushed with everything she had, pouring all her pain and fear and love into one final effort. She felt something give way, felt a rush of warmth and wetness, and then the sound of a baby crying. "It's a boy," Mrs. Henderson announced, her voice triumphant. "A beautiful, healthy boy." Elena collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but alive. Through her tears, she saw Mrs. Henderson cleaning her son, saw his tiny fists waving in the air, heard his strong, angry cry that proclaimed to the world that he was alive and well. "Miguel," she whispered. "His name is Miguel." But when Mrs. Henderson placed the baby in her arms, Elena looked into eyes that were unmistakably Ezra's blue as a summer sky, bright with intelligence and curiosity. For a moment, she was confused. The baby was supposed to look like Miguel, was supposed to carry his father's features. Then she understood. This child might have been conceived by another man, but he would be shaped by the man who chose to raise him. He would learn Ezra's values, inherit his strength, carry on his legacy. Biology was just the beginning, everything else was choice. "Hello, Miguel," Elena whispered, touching his tiny hand with her finger. "I'm your mama." The baby's eyes seemed to focus on her face, and Elena felt something shift inside her chest. All the pain, all the fear, all the uncertainty of the past months, it was all worth it for this moment, for this perfect little person who was part of her and part of Miguel, and part of something new and wonderful. "He's beautiful," Ezra said, his voice rough with emotion. "He's absolutely perfect." Elena looked up at her husband, not the man who had won her in a card game, not the stranger who had offered her shelter, but the man who had chosen to love her and her child unconditionally. She saw tears on his cheeks, saw wonder in his eyes, saw a love so deep it took her breath away. "Do you want to hold him?" she asked. Ezra nodded, unable to speak. He took the baby with infinite care, as if he were handling the most precious thing in the world. And maybe he was. "Hello, son," he whispered. "I'm your papa." Outside, the storm was beginning to ease. The wind had died down, and Elena could see patches of blue sky through the breaking clouds. The worst was over, for all of them. Mrs. Henderson packed up her supplies with the satisfaction of a job well done. "He's a strong baby," she said. "Good lungs, good reflexes. He'll grow up to be a fine man." "Yes," Elena said, watching Ezra cradle their son. "He will." As the afternoon wore on, neighbors began to arrive, having braved the storm to check on the new family. Jim Thompson brought fresh meat and congratulations. Carl Hendricks carried a hand-carved cradle that had been in his family for generations. The women brought food and baby clothes and advice. Elena watched from her bed as her community welcomed her son, as they accepted him as one of their own, without question or judgment. This was what she'd been fighting for all along, not just freedom, but belonging. Not just survival, but the chance to build something beautiful. "What do you think?" Ezra asked, settling into the chair beside her bed with the baby in his arms. "Was it worth it? All the pain, all the struggle?" Elena looked at her husband and her son, at the life they'd built together against all odds. "Every bit of it," she said. "Every single bit." Outside, the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and pink. It was beautiful, but Elena barely noticed. She was too busy memorizing this moment, the weight of her baby in her arms, the warmth of Ezra's hand in hers, the sound of their son's quiet breathing. She'd won more than her freedom. She'd won a future. Spring came to the valley like a promise kept, melting the snow and bringing new life to the world. Little Miguel was 4 months old now, a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everyone and seemed to find joy in the simplest things: a butterfly outside the window, the sound of his father's voice, the feeling of sun on his face. Elena stood in the vegetable garden, her hands dirty from planting and her face warm from the morning sun. The baby lay on a blanket nearby, gurgling happily as he watched the clouds drift across the blue sky. It was a perfect day, the kind that made Elena believe that maybe, just maybe, all their troubles were behind them. Then she heard the sound of horses approaching, and her blood turned to ice. Ezra emerged from the barn, his face grim with recognition. "It's Morse," he said quietly, "and he's got the sheriff with him." Elena's heart sank. She'd known this day would come, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon. But she'd hoped foolishly, desperately, that maybe Morse had given up, that maybe the legal system would see reason. But as the riders drew closer, Elena could see that hope was misplaced. Morse rode beside Sheriff Davidson, a thin man with cold eyes and a badge that gave him the authority to destroy lives. Behind them came 2 more men. Elena didn't recognize, lawyers, probably, with their expensive clothes and confident bearing. "Mrs. Blackwood," Morse called out as they approached. "I trust you've been well?" Elena picked up the baby, holding him close to her chest. "What do you want, Morse?" "I want what's owed to me," Morse said smoothly. "I've been patient, more patient than most men would be. But patience has its limits." Sheriff Davidson dismounted, his hand resting on his gun. "Mrs. Blackwood, I have a court order here requiring you to surrender yourself and your child to settle the debts of your late father." "My father's debts died with him," Elena said, though her voice shook slightly. "I'm afraid that's not how the law works," one of the lawyers said, stepping forward. "Debts can be inherited, especially when they're secured by specific collateral." "She's not collateral," Ezra said, moving to stand beside Elena. "She's my wife. A marriage contracted under false pretenses," the lawyer continued. "Our investigation has revealed that Mrs. Blackwood was already legally bound to another party when she married you. The marriage is therefore invalid." Elena felt the world spinning around her. "What other party?" "Clayton Morse," the lawyer said with satisfaction. "Your father signed a binding contract, pledging you in marriage to settle his debts. Mr. Mills was merely a temporary arrangement until Mr. Morse could claim his property." "That's impossible," Elena said. But even as she spoke, she remembered her father's nervous behavior in the weeks before she was sold to Mills. The hushed conversations, the mysterious visitors, the way he'd avoided her eyes when he told her about the marriage. "I have the documents right here," the lawyer said, producing a folder thick with papers. "Signed and witnessed, completely legal under territorial law. Elena looked at the papers, seeing her father's familiar handwriting, the official seals and signatures. It was all there, all legal and binding, and completely devastating. Even if that's true, Ezra said desperately, she's had a child since then. The baby is innocent in all this. The child is part of the collateral, Morse said coldly. As I explained before, half Mexican children are quite valuable in certain markets. Elena felt something snap inside her. All the fear, all the running, all the desperate attempts to build a life, it was all for nothing. She was still property, still something to be bought and sold and traded like livestock. No, she said quietly. I beg your pardon? Morse asked. I said no, Elena repeated, her voice growing stronger. I won't go with you. I won't let you take my child. Sheriff Davidson stepped forward, his hand moving to his gun. Ma'am, you don't have a choice. The law is the law. The law is wrong, Elena said, her voice ringing across the yard. No person should be able to own another person. No child should be sold to pay his grandfather's debts. Mrs. Blackwood, the sheriff said wearily, I don't make the laws. I just enforce them. Now you can come peacefully, or I can arrest you for refusing to comply with a court order. Elena looked around at the valley she'd come to love, at the cabin where she'd found happiness, at the man who had given her everything and asked for nothing in return. This was her home, her life, her choice. Then arrest me, she said. Elena, no, Ezra said urgently. If you resist, they'll just use force. Think about the baby. I am thinking about the baby, Elena said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I'm thinking about what kind of world I want him to grow up in. I'm thinking about what kind of woman I want to be. She turned to face Morse, her chin raised defiantly. You can take my body, but you can't take my spirit. You can call me your property, but you can't make me accept it. And you can try to sell my child, but you'll never make him anything less than free. We'll see about that, Morse said, nodding to the sheriff. But before Davidson could move, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. Elena looked up to see a familiar figure riding hard toward them, Miguel, his face grim with determination. What's he doing here? Ezra asked. I sent for him, Elena said. If I was going to lose my freedom, I wanted my son to at least know his real father. Miguel dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his eyes taking in the Senate, the sheriff, the lawyers, the papers that meant Elena's doom. Am I too late? Too late for what? Morse demanded. Too late to stop this travesty, Miguel said, pulling a thick envelope from his saddlebag. I've been investigating your so-called legal claim, Mr. Morse, and I've discovered some very interesting things. Such as? The lawyer asked, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. Such as the fact that Elena's father never had the legal right to pledge her in marriage, Miguel said. According to territorial law, a woman cannot be used as collateral for a debt without her explicit consent. Since Elena was never asked to agree to the arrangement, the contract is invalid. That's ridiculous, Morse sputtered. Fathers have been arranging marriages for their daughters for centuries. Arranging, yes, Miguel said, but not pledging them as collateral for gambling debts. There's a difference, and the law recognizes it. He handed the envelope to Sheriff Davidson, who opened it with obvious reluctance. As he read, his face grew pale. This is a ruling from the Territorial Supreme Court, he said slowly. It says that contracts using human beings as collateral are invalid under territorial law. That ruling was issued last month, Miguel said. Too late to help Elena when she was sold to Mills, but not too late to help her now. Elena felt hope blooming in her chest like a flower after a long winter. Does that mean? It means you're free, Miguel said. Completely and legally free. Your marriage to Ezra is valid. Your child is yours. And no one can take either of you away. Morse's face had gone purple with rage. This is outrageous. I've invested time and money in this venture. I demand compensation. Sue the estate, Miguel said with a shrug. Good luck collecting from a dead man. Sheriff Davidson folded the papers and handed them back to Miguel. Looks like this matter is closed, he said. Mrs. Blackwood, you're free to go. I'm already home, Elena said, looking around at the valley she'd fought so hard to stay in. As Morse and his men rode away, their dreams of profit shattered. Elena felt something she'd never experienced before: complete and total freedom. Not just physical freedom, but emotional freedom. The weight of her father's debts, the fear of being reclaimed, the constant looking over her shoulder, it was all gone. "How did you know?" she asked Miguel. "How did you know to look for that ruling?" "I didn't," Miguel admitted. "I was just looking for any loophole, any technicality that might help. Sometimes the law works in mysterious ways." Elena handed the baby to Ezra and walked over to Miguel. Without a word, she stood on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. Thank you for giving me the chance to be part of his life," Miguel said, looking at the baby in Ezra's arms. "Even if it's not the way I originally planned." "You'll always be welcome here," Ezra said. He should know his father. As the sun set over the valley, Elena stood on her porch, watching her husband and the father of her child talking quietly while the baby slept in Ezra's arms. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but it was the life she'd chosen, and that made all the difference. She was free. Her son was free. And for the first time in her life, Elena Blackwood knew exactly where she belonged.